Thanks for tuning in to Discover Stories on Reimagine Radio. Before we get started, here's a word from our sponsor.
Do you wish you had a voice in making some of the world's most popular websites more accessible? Fable is recruiting a community of paid assistive technology users who work from home to test websites and provide feedback on how they can be improved. We're currently recruiting testers who use Dragon, voice control, eye tracking, switch controls, and head mice. No resume, no cover letter, and no experience with user testing is required. Learn more and apply at www.makeitfable.com/community.
And I think it also allows us, when we work with multiple disability communities, the opportunity to discuss and explore what conflicting access needs look like. Because just because we make things accessible for one community doesn't mean that we haven't made a barrier for another community.
Yeah.
Right? And so what does that look like? And what do we do when that happens? And exploring all of those different things. Because sometimes adding all of your accessibility into one show makes it a barrier for different communities. And so, this is when you go back to so why is the ASL performance or the ASL performance on a different night than the audio described performance, for example, or open description? Because if the open description is available, right? So if everybody's hearing the description and you have captions, then you also have to provide the description in the captions, which deaf people might not want because they can see. And it might just be too much for them to read.
Yeah.
But but from an equity perspective, if it is heard out loud for the audience to hear, then the equitable thing to do is to make sure that that's captured in the captions, right? Or that the ASL interpreters or deaf interpreters are interpreting that piece as well, right? For people with partial sight, they may see deaf folks doing sign language or ASL interpreters doing sign language and not be able to tell what that is and ask themselves, what is that character doing? I can't make out what that movement is. Right. And so that could also be a barrier to them understanding what's happening with the show on stage, because 90% of the blind community has a little bit of partial sight. So, is that a conflict or is it not? Right. So we don't know until we start exploring what is this piece of work we're looking at, and does it serve the work, and does it serve the audience member or the community that we're inviting into the space. Right. And so sometimes you have to say, this show tonight is deaf and hard of hearing friendly, and this show tomorrow night is blind and low vision friendly, and this show on a third night is a relaxed performance, because relaxed performances may not be great for blind folks with guide dogs. When you have people coming and going and moving around in a space, that can make guide dogs nervous. So, it's really about trying to find that balance, and it's not about segregation, because it's about making sure that folks who have access needs get what they need.
Yeah. In a non-confusing manner.
That's right. Yeah. So I think we have to let go of this idea of segregation, because it may look like that from an outsider's perspective, that why aren't we all doing everything together all the time? But the conflicting access needs means that nobody gets what they need. And what kind of harm are we doing then?
Yeah. Yeah. Right? Because perhaps for somebody who, is sitting there with no disabilities, it's like, well, if you just have all three, then you can just hit all the stones at once. But it isn't. But it wasn't made for their comfort either. It wasn't made for them to feel good either.
And this is often what you have to explain to theater companies who don't have any experience with disability, when they say, "Oh, we want to do performances that have all relaxed performance, ASL, and audio description, whatever, and let's do it all on the same night." It may not work that way, right? So, explaining to them why and the how, and again, this is with communities. So you get these communities together, and you say, "Well, this is the idea of putting these all together. Tell these folks why or why not, right? Don't let us all speak on your behalf."
Yeah.
Because that doesn't work either, right? So, because there might be an opportunity where all these things will work perfectly together. Maybe you've got a theater that holds 1,000 people, and you can have one section for relaxed performance guests and once, like, I don't know. I don't know what the circumstance is. That's why we have creative access, because we just don't know what our resources are for what show, what the circumstances are. The variables change every time.
Yeah.
So if we just think about it like a one size fits all ticking the boxes kind of checklist, then I think that we risk doing more harm than good, and we risk destroying relationships instead of building relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not my jam. I'm not into that. I'm into like knowing who's in my community and knowing who wants to be a part of my community and meeting folks and working with folks and
and creating bridges,
building love, building friendships.
Yeah. It's just so interesting how even just within our conversation, I just have a better idea already, too, of also being able to be more cognizant of the factors that are taking place, and just being more aware, I guess, of how to make my work as well, or the way I communicate to other people as inclusive as possible without making how'd I say this? Just like, creating bridges instead of keeping up those barriers or being complacent to just how things have always been done. And I know you've sort of hinted at this. I mean, you've talked about this essentially, but I guess in a more direct sense, I'd love for you to answer the question of what changes would you like to see in the arts industry regarding the inclusion of artists with disabilities?
Well, I suppose this seems like an overly simplistic response. At the core, we need some funding that's reliable and sustainable.
Yeah.
That goes to artists that have lived experience of disability that want to do projects. It goes for organizations that want to bring in accessibility. Because it's one of the questions that I get asked the most is, we really want to bring in access, but we don't have the financial resources to do it. Or even the financial resources to bring in a consultant that can help us build in the creative access piece.
Yeah.
So at its core, we need that. We need organizations and artists to think about putting in an access line in their budgets for everything that they do. So that's like a changing cultural practice.
Yeah.
That needs to happen. We need changes in, everybody should have an EDIA-J committee that should have people with lived experience of disability on it. But like from a cultural perspective, we need to be having conversations about lived experience. I mean, we need to have conversations about all equity seeking groups.
Yeah.
But my lens is disability, right? But there needs to be active training, which comes from disability community members, not like, let's hire a third party organization that are a bunch of able-bodied people teaching us about disability. So I do a lot of training around disability etiquette and disability justice for organizations. I will cater that training to whatever they need, whether it's about accessible hiring, I don't know, changing systems within the workplace about what accessible documents look like, what accessible hiring packages look like, what proper language could be within the organization, how to treat people with dignity and respect. Because we don't know what we don't know. That's not an excuse. That's let's learn how to do better in an environment that has no judgment, right? You can ask your ridiculous questions that you don't have language for in the space that I'm in, and I can show you what the language is to be dignified and to hold dignity when we're with colleagues. I think we also need to make the process of finding how to get this money easier. When I apply for grants, the process isn't accessible. From a screen reader perspective, it's so labor intensive. It just would be nice if I could get on the phone and talk with a grants officer and be like, this is my project. This is my idea. Can we chat through it? Can you write it down for me? Can you, right? Like, can you be my advocate within the inside of the organization as the grants officer? on my behalf, because able-bodied folks, can go back and forth to the portal, can fill things in, can stop. Like, I don't have the ability to do that. One, I can't access the portal, but I just, and they give you you can apply for a stipend to have an able-bodied person help you with your grant writing, which is great, but it's like $200. And like grant writers get paid thousands of dollars to write grants. It's like $80 an hour to write a grant. So nobody's going to help you write a grant for $200.
Yeah.
So like those numbers are not proportional for the kind of support that I would need to write a grant. So those are the kinds of things that I think are still very, very big barriers. I'd apply for many more things that I have dreams about doing, small projects, big projects. Like, why don't we have grants for really small projects that are like $1,000, $1,500, $3,000 instead of having to apply for $25,000 all the time?
Yeah. And
I also think this should go for every artist, but I also think that artists with disabilities shouldn't have to pay additional taxes on this money. This money, like, we get our money. This is just my own soapbox, but our arts money that comes from our government funders, whether they be federal or provincial, this is public money, right? This is taxpayers' money that is supporting the arts. We all as taxpayers pay taxes on our money, and so if the federal government gives me $25,000 to do an arts project, I have to pay taxes on that money. Personal taxes, but I haven't earned that money. I don't get $25,000.
Yeah.
That money goes to pay for the theater and, the equipment, whatever we rent cameras or lighting or whatever we have to rent, the other actors, the director, the costumes. Like, it goes like, you have no money at the end of it. You're mostly out of pocket at the end of it. Like, we're not making a lot of money doing this. If I make $1,100 for a show, that runs for a week or 2 weeks. But don't forget, I've had to, rehearse it for 2 months before I've done it. I have to workshop it, right? Like, this is not a lot of money. But I shouldn't have to pay taxes on that money. So when you get that $25,000, if I apply for it personally, I have to pay whatever tax bracket I'm in. Let's say, I don't know what it is, but so they tell you to take the first 20% of that and put it in a separate bank account. So I lose 20% of that money right off the top. Yeah. But it's my own like personal taxes because I'm not a theater company. So I just don't think that is right.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah.
And is a big barrier for artists, especially artists with disabilities.
Absolutely.
Anyways, that's me on my soapbox. And I don't really think that it's necessary to do that. It's like skimming off the top. If we really want to make arts viable and accessible and high quality and, available for everybody, and if we really care about arts in our community, we make that as easy as possible for everybody to be able to access it, whether we're creating it, being a part of it, or consuming it.
Yeah.
End of sentence.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Mic drop. Like, but yeah. No, I think. Well, I'm just getting to learn all these parts of your advocacy and like all these parts of you through this conversation. And this is these are huge barriers. Absolutely, because like if it's not applying for the grant, it's what happens after you get the grant. It's like, being aware of the implications as well of being offered a grant and having to pay that out of pocket, which absolutely no, I totally see why it's just not how do I say that? It's just not like viable. Like it makes it harder for folks, if anything, because that's another thing to worry about afterwards. Yeah. So it's not really just about like, hooray, we got the grant. It's like, okay, also one more thing, you have to pay taxes on it as well.
There are so many things to think about, and especially if you're doing it for your first time and you're navigating the system all by yourself, and you're like, oh, right. As a blind person, I have to keep track of every receipt. Well, I don't read receipts because I can't see receipts. So maybe I need to hire a producer. Well, that's another expense, right? Yeah. Maybe I need to hire a bookkeeper. Maybe I need to hire an accountant.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't have thought about doing any of those things had I not had other artists who are like, well, you can do these things. And I was like, oh, I can, I should.
Mm-hmm.
What do these people do? What does a producer do? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't know some of these things because you're new to applying for grants or haven't, don't have a master's in theater or a bachelor's in theater, because many of us in the disability community may not have had the privilege to go to theater school for all sorts of, reasons that have systemic barriers attached to them. I certainly don't have a master's in fine arts or a bachelor's in fine arts. I have a PhD in the hard knocks of life. I'm not an academic. And so I don't know the ins and outs of all of the positions of everybody that works in theater until I work with people and I go, oh, that's what they do. I get it now.
Yeah.
And a lot of these people are wearing these multiple hats, in small sort of creative teams and doing all this work themselves. And it's like, so if you have a disability and you are already, your CRIP time or your disability standard time, you're already working on a different time continuum because of disability and stamina. That's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot to keep all of that organized and all of that, who books the space, who pays the actors, who makes, it's a lot, and that's just hard. It's a lot. And so you can see why somebody might say, you know what, I have this great idea, but I don't have the ability to do the follow through.
Yeah.
And I don't know who I could ask for to help me do that. I haven't built a network of people who I could reach out to that want to be a part of this, so I could see that being super overwhelming.
Yeah, no, it is very overwhelming. And I imagine that when you're especially in that space and you're having to balance and put on all these different hats, you're also just like constantly not just overwhelmed, but just like tired. And it becomes less about this project that you like care so much for. And especially if you have a disability, it's just like, well, how can I cope with all of this and take care of myself? Yeah, it becomes that like misalignment of like wanting to do this, but also just like this is too much and I didn't really know what I signed up for, or just that, especially, or like feeling alone in the process too.
And how much might that deter you from doing the next thing? So this is why I think like it's great to have like a $1,500 grant where you can like just sort of get an experience of what a small project might be. Maybe you want to do a 2-day workshop on teaching people how you write poetry, right? Small, easy, something that you can just sort of build on. But we just don't have those same kind of ways of being able to slowly grow in to the process. We kind of expect people to be able to do all or nothing. At least that's what my experience has been.
Yeah. And I mean, like through this conversation, you've already like talked about all these different hats that you yourself are wearing. And at the end of the day, you're also just part of the gig economy. So how does that play out in your life? Like how do you find that to be?
Well, the gig economy is a tough thing. And I think, a lot of artists are doing multiple things at multiple times. Some of them are doing, it used to be the old joke, right? Like you would go to Los Angeles or you would hear that, actors were also, waiters or waitresses at the time. That was the term, it's servers, right?
Yeah.
And, you'd be at a restaurant and they'd say, well, I'm an actor. And, okay, right. I'm just waiting to make it big.
Yeah.
And that used to kind of be the old tropey joke of it. But the truth of the matter is that, you just can't make a living on being an actor alone or being a performer or an artist alone sometimes, especially in a city like Vancouver, where it literally costs so much to be able to just have your basic needs covered, if we can even do that. So the gig economy can look like a lot of different things. For me, I have a level of privilege where I've been able to get a part-time employment job, and lots of people do this as well. But I'm employed by a large arts organization. So I still get to work in the arts. So I'm employed part-time,
Mhm.
but at least I know that I'm guaranteed part-time hours as employment as opposed to self-employment hours. Now,
Okay.
those hours and that money would not be enough if that was my only job, would not be enough to live off of. But I know that if I didn't have any self-employed gigs,
Mhm.
that I would at least have something coming in. So that always means that I have to make sure that I have tried to save enough money month by month to keep myself afloat, which is also really hard to do.
Mhm.
But that's what I have to do. I have to choose, do I go out for dinner with friends, or do I have the bowl of soup instead of the big meal? You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
I have to make my choices differently.
Yeah.
And I look for every opportunity to pinch and save and upcycle instead of buy. Like I look for all of those opportunities. But in terms of like the gig economy, I'm always networking, and I'm always looking for that next opportunity to work with people. And you won't find me. I don't have a website. Well, that's not true. I have a website for my Through My Lens project, but I don't have a personal website that's about my my accessibility consulting work. And I've always wanted to have one, but those are expensive to create.
Yeah.
And I would need to make sure that it was accessible. So it's even more expensive, and it's harder to find somebody who understands how to create a website accessibly. So if anybody out there knows how to create a screen reader accessible website and wants to work with me on mates rates, and I'm not talking about like nothing, but just, be flexible, that would be nice. But so I have been lucky in that I've worked with enough folks that they continue to come back for other projects, and they tell people about me. And so through word of mouth for the last 15 years, I've been able to sustain myself through word of mouth. Now, that's not always going to be the thing for me, but there are very few folks that do what I do. And I'm not trying to toot my own horn here, but not everybody in the disability community, just because you have a disability doesn't mean that you can or should be a consultant. And sometimes people put out like these open calls for consultants, with lived experience of disability. But that doesn't mean that people, for example, just because you're blind doesn't mean you know anything about standards within the blind community in terms of, anything, right? Like you may not know the standards of tactile walking surface indicators, or what accessible pedestrian signals are, what audible pedestrian signals are, what are those features, So if a municipality was saying we need a consultant to consult on, accessible street crossings, we need some blind folks. Do you know what any of those features are, or are you a user? So it depends on what kind of consultant you need.
Yeah.
So if you are a user, an audience member of arts, and you want to give an audience perspective, that's a different thing than what I do. I mean, I obviously can do that because I am an audience member, but I'm the next level or next levels. I'm the strategist, right? Like I said, I'm the accessibility strategist. I'm the creative access
thought leader.
Thought leader on that, with more than 15 years experience now in all of this stuff. I travel the world. I stay on top of what's current best practices in language. I'm deeply invested in community, not just locally, but internationally, across Canada, across the US, across the UK, with artists that are everywhere, right? I want to know what they're doing. I want to know how they're exploring access. I travel to see other artists with disability shows in different parts of the country and the world. And like, this is what I do as part of my work. It's never not on my mind. Accessibility in general, when I travel, I'm like, where are the tactile walking surface indicators? Where, like, what does their accessible signage look like here? So whether it's something about physical infrastructure, which is really where I got my start. I didn't get my start in the arts. I got my start working with municipalities. So I know a lot about building code and CSA standards and all sorts of things, which also is a benefit when you're doing site audits. And is this theater accessible? What do we need to make the physical building accessible, right? So I can bring all of that into play. So gigs look like what gigs look like. And I am flexible enough to be able to say to an organization, what are your needs?
Yeah.
And they will say, I need X, Y, and Z. And I will say, okay, this is what I can provide you with. And I can customize this piece for what you need. And everything I do is customized. And people would say to me, well, why don't you just make like training modules and record them and sell them, or like, make a program? And it's like, I can do that. But then people say, well, I need this part, but not this part. So I'm customizing it anyways. And, if we truly believe that accessibility and the disability experience is diverse, which it is, because we're all individual human beings, then there's no one size fits all module. It's all about customization. And every organization that I work with, or every artist, or every human that I work with, is at a different part on this accessibility continuum. Right? Yeah. So one of the things that I always say when people are like, so what do you do? How do you work? And I say, well, I think about accessibility as a continuum, and continuums don't end, right?
Yeah.
But I ask people to think about where they are on a continuum. So if we think about accessibility and inclusion, how much do you know about accessibility? In your organization, how accessible do you think you are? How inclusive do you think you are? Pick where you are on that continuum. I know a little, I know a lot, intermediate, wherever you think you are, and make purposeful, meaningful steps to move forward. And that's where you start, right? If you're committed to just moving forward with purposeful, meaningful steps, they can be small steps, they can be big steps. Those steps can look like whatever they look like, but they're purposeful and they're meaningful, and they, build relationships, and they don't induce harm as we take them. Yeah. Right. And sometimes we take these huge leaps and we do harm while we do that, because we think that big leaps get us to the finish line faster. Well, there's no finish line, right? Because the world keeps changing. So this is why I think that in talking with organizations or artists or whoever I'm working with, that sets up sort of the working structure, in that I will customize anything that you need in this moment. And that doesn't mean that if you say you need X, that I won't give you Y and Z, because that comes up in our conversation. Because that's what I do, right? Like if the contract says you want X and it turns out we need Y and Z, well, yeah, I'm giving you Y and Z. I'm not going to say to you, well, that's not in the contract, because that's not how I work. I got bills to pay, absolutely. But I care more about the work. I care more about the knowledge that's transferred. I care more about the fact that the community gets something that they need out of the experience. The work means so much to me that I would almost do it for free if I could, right? Yeah. I work on a working scale, so that I don't, a sliding scale, so that I don't have to say to folks, well, if you can't pay this, I won't work with you. That's not how I roll. Because I know that even if I take a loss on something in terms of, how many hours I put in versus, air quotes, what I think my time is worth, or what I could get on another job, all of that stuff you think about. And it's so hard to think about what your time is worth as a self-employed person. Like everybody grapples with what is my time worth versus, what I know versus all of those things. We all grapple with that. I know that the person that I work with will have a quality experience. And I know that that quality experience means a bunch of things. One, it means that they'll come back to me. Two, it means that they'll recommend me. Three, it means that I've made an impression on behalf of the entire disability community. And I know what that sounds like, because I know I don't speak for the community, but I feel this pressure of, if somebody who works with me has a bad experience with me, that it looks like, well, I worked with somebody with a disability, so therefore all people with disabilities are bad to work with. Yeah. But if they work with me and they have a good experience, then maybe it's the opposite. I've worked with people with disabilities before. I worked with Amy. It was fantastic. Therefore, I would love to work with more people in the disability community. And that's kind of like, that's the impression I want to leave, is like, don't be afraid to work with us. Yeah. We're professional. We're, we're honest, we know our stuff, all of those things I want to leave as an imprint on folks, so that they so that we can reduce some of the stigmas that have systemically been, placed upon our community. And then they also can come to me because I also always say to them, if you're looking for folks that do different things in the disability community, I've got a list of folks that I work with, graphic designers, active listeners, whoever. I've got a group of folks that live with disability that have different skill sets that I've worked with before, that I know how they work, website auditors. I've built teams of people that I work with that I hire to do work with me, and then I hire out and I recommend for other projects. So I'm building this little working community through the stuff that I do. And that really, really feels good. And that's why I think that I network so hard. It's not just with people that I know that are going to contract me to do stuff. It's also with my community who I know that I can contract out, who I know do good work, who I know I can rely on when they say, well, Amy recommended so-and-so. So and when I ask for some, like I was looking for active listeners the other day for a project, and I reached out to a friend who I thought would be a great active listener. And they said to me, oh, I would love to do this. Please keep me in mind for future projects. I'm not available, but I can recommend these two people. So I reached out to two people, and those two people said to me, well, if you're a friend of the person that put us in contact, like, we know you're great because that person is great, and they would never recommend somebody who isn't great. And so all of a sudden I have these two new people in my network that are fantastic humans who not only are great at the work of doing an active listener, but also have a whole bunch of other things that they do, which are other great skills that can be hired out for different things. So, I sought them out for one specific position. And now I know more about them and their lived experience and their background. And I keep all of that confidential because I know all of their intersections of disability and their experiences of whatever it is, trauma or, any of their identities, because those things are things that I need to know in order to, especially for active listeners. If people don't know what active listeners are, they can be there at a theater production if the production has content that may be harmful. Some people use the word triggering, but harmful to people. So if you have a show that I first experienced active listeners at a show that was about the experience of Indigenous residential schools. And they had Indigenous folks who had been in the residential school system, and they had Indigenous folks who were trained counselors as active listeners. And so if Indigenous folks were in that room watching this show and were remembering things, feelings were coming up, trauma was coming up for them, they could leave the theater, they could go at any time, they could talk to somebody who had a shared experience, or they could talk to a trained counselor. So an active listener is not a trained counselor, but there's somebody who has a shared experience. And so that means I know people's intersections, so that when a show comes up, I can say, well, person A has shared with me in private that they identify as trans with a background of child abuse and substance abuse. And that works for this show. Whereas this other show talks about suicide and imprisonment, right? So you want to have somebody who is able to relate to experiences that are relevant to the show, who knows how to protect themselves when having conversations, who knows that this is not a counselor's position, because they're not to give advice. They're just to be able to sit in a space where they understand how another human being may feel. And have that sort of shared experience of, we can sit and not talk, we can sit and talk, whatever you need in this moment. I am here to be your person right now. But you have to know a lot of personal things about a human before you can say to them, I think you're a good fit as an active listener for this show, which means you have to share a lot about yourself. And that means I'm the container to hold a lot of information that's really personal about a lot of people. And you can imagine what kind of trust that takes. So for these two people who didn't know me before 2 weeks ago, from a friend that knows me really well, who put us in touch, you can see the level of trust that takes. And it's built a lot of really beautiful things. So I hold their identities in my trust bubble, and I invite them to work on shows that I think they might be good for. And I always make sure that they know what the show's about, that they get a script. But I'm building this bubble of active listeners, and I pay them well to do this work. And sometimes people utilize them during a show and sometimes they don't. But I believe that this work has value. And I believe that there are community members who have these experiences, these lived experiences of various different intersections in our lives, that are offering to share or be a listener or hold space for other people. And if we're asking those people to do that for free, I think that's harmful. Right? But I'm going to work with these folks who want to be active listeners. I'm going to build a training program. This is where I need like a $3,000 funding model. I'm going to pay for these people to get their mental health first aid certificate. So they at least have that a part of it to help them feel confident should they want it. It's not compulsory. You don't have to have it to be an active listener. But what a nice thing to have in your toolkit of toolkits of things, right? So this is just like another project, and it's not a side project, but it's another gig that I'm working on to try and promote it when I'm working with festivals and theater companies about the content that they're putting on our stages, but also to get our community members work, because we're all working in the gig economy. That was a long story to talk about the gig economy.
Yeah, no, but I enjoyed it.